So let me quickly introduce Patrick Bresette, who is the Executive Director of Public Works. If you're not familiar with Public Works, I'm sure after this session you will Google them and look at their really incredible website where they work in the arena of building public will around government, the economy, public budgets, taxes, and race. We became familiar with Patrick through his work at Demos a couple of years ago when we were learning about framing, and as many of you know, we're on a journey to reframe human services. And we found that Patrick and his association, Public Works, his organization, really are in the forefront of the art and science of framing. Patrick has, I think, very interestingly, a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Sculpture from the New York State College of Ceramics, which clearly qualifies him for this work, or sculpting. And importantly, he has an MPA from the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. You're going to enjoy listening to him. You're going to want to come back to the slides afterwards and understand them more. And we hope that you'll become a part of our reframing network as we move forward on the subject of reframing human services. But today we wanted to share with you someone who really understands framing and his specific work, the public sector. So with that, Patrick, we turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Irv. I'm very glad to join you all today. Let me just tag over to my slides here. Bear with me one second. So as Irv mentioned, I work for an organization called Public Works. We've been around for about a decade. A couple of years ago, we spun off from Demos and started our own standalone nonprofit, but we've been doing the same kind of work around the country for quite a while. The folks at the National Assembly asked if I would reflect a little bit on how we've approached doing our work as kind of a model for how other people in other sectors might think about how they approach changing kind of public attitudes and building public will for the kinds of changes they're seeking. So my goal today is to give you a little bit of background on the kind of theories and approach to communications and engagement that we have based our work on, and then also to give you a little bit about what we found out and what we take out to the field when we're trying to help advocates and nonprofits and public managers and others change the public conversation about the role of government in this country. So we have a small team, about 6 of us, with a very giant mission, which is just to rebuild support for the public sector in the face of a lot of anti-government kind of work that we have, that's anti-government kind of rhetoric that we all face every day. Sorry, let me get this back up here. I'll proceed. I can get this to pull up. So we have a set of work that we've done over the years. We've sponsored a set of research. It was originally with the Frameworks Institute that I know is doing work for the Human Services Assembly now. Some of that research team ultimately spun off as an organization called Topos, and we've been working with them for about the past decade on research into how people think and reason about the role of government, about government's role in the economy, about budgets and taxes, et cetera. We also have done a fair amount of work across the country. We've been in 37 states in one way or another over the years. We have worked with advocates, policy organizations, nonprofit organizations, coalitions, et cetera, people who all who feel like the current attitudes about government get in the way of their kind of policy goals. And I know from looking at a lot of the members of this association and organizations I've worked with around the country, particularly in the area of human services, the challenge of trying to improve public support for funding for those programs that come from the public sector, to engage people differently on the clients of those programs, et cetera. One thing I think that certainly this work, and I know what Irv was mentioning earlier, is that we are really trying to use the kind of research that is really about digging more deeply into how people think and reason. And so while standard polling has a lot of useful purposes in this work, we engaged a set of people who are trying to figure out why you get certain answers on those polls. They involve people who are linguists and cultural anthropologists and psychologists, as well as public opinion specialists. Particularly in our role, in our work, trying to change attitudes about government, we need to know at a pretty deep level what's going on in the culture about that. Next. A good quote about the importance of building public will from a former president here. I'll let you read it, but the focus here on public sentiment, and if you can get public sentiment on your side, that makes the possibility of moving statutes or public policy change all the more possible. Next. One of the fundamental ideas that grounds this work and a lot of the framing research is an assertion that none of us are blank slates, that we all come loaded with a set of preconceptions and stereotypes and lived experiences. Some of those are on the next slide here listed out. You can, I think one of the challenges for those of us who do a lot of kind of pretty wonky policy work is that we tend to assume that if we were just to give people all the information that we knew about a topic, they would become experts like us, and then we often hope that they would have the same opinion about these questions that we have. But all of us come to almost any kind of conversation, particularly policy ones, with a lot of preconceived things that we are operating out of. Next slide. Another way of thinking about this is that these frames or these kinds of stereotypes or kind of embedded perceptions are often also part of what people call master narratives. And again, when we engage in public debates, we are not just conduits of information. We are actually tapping into and triggering and sometimes actually bumping up against master narratives that are beneath the kind of details of the policy. I'll give you an example of that here in the next couple of slides. Robert Reich has written quite a bit about what he calls the four parables of American politics, and these are examples of master narratives. Two of them he talks about that are kind of deeply American stories are that of the self-made man, but also of the kind of benevolent community, and these are fundamentally stories of independence versus interdependence. These are both part of the fabric of how we see ourselves in this country. He and other people who do observe our culture would suggest that particularly in the last couple of decades, perhaps the story of independence, kind of you're on your own, has been getting a lot of the juice. We live in a kind of hyper-consumer culture, which also reinforces some of that. But all of us who are working to improve support for services that meet the needs of people, or in my perspective, kind of working on issues of public programs, really need to be consciously trying to evoke and reinforce notions of how we are all connected, of notions of interdependence. And there are ways that we can do that in how we tell our story, and also ways that we can inadvertently trigger stories of independence that don't help us. Next. The corollary of that is that if people are really kind of operating out of a dominant narrative of independence, and that the choices and decisions are their own to make and their kind of outcomes are equally there, it's very difficult to make the case for kind of collective problem solving. Stories about independence often trigger notions of those being the problem of that individual or my problem, and therefore the solutions are just individual. I think all of us on this call are probably interested in how we drive more collective problem solving, and again, paying attention to these narratives and how they affect our work is important. Next. A quick little definition here about what we mean by frames or framing, one that I like from my colleagues at Topos. Really taps into the fact that the human beings are natural kind of storytellers and are always trying to make sense of the enormous amount of information, often random, coming at us. And so you can even see in this slide, what is it about us over thousands of years that look up at this random pattern of dots in the sky at night and create full-fledged stories that are connected to our culture and our spirituality and kind of history. And so even something as simple as constellations are in effect putting a frame around random information and trying to make sense of it in the context of our existence. Next. You can click through again on that. Another definition, sorry, back up one. You'll get these slides, folks, so you don't have to take a lot of notes on the text. Stephen Reese has written kind of the seminal books in this field called Framing Public Life. And he talks about frames as organizing principles that are socially shared and persistent over time. They work symbolically to structure the world, and they pose patterns. And so I think it's really important for those of us trying to communicate with a busy and distracted public about our complex issues to recognize that there are pretty dominant frames that structure people's thinking, and to be aware of that. Find the ones that work for us, and be careful not to trigger the ones that take people in a problematic direction. Next. Another kind of warning out of the research and the science of this work is that framing is always going on, and so there really is no neutral communication, even though we might like to pretend that. And therefore, if we don't pay attention to how we frame and shape the way we talk about our issues, people will default to what is often called in this field kind of pictures in their heads. Next. So just take a look at this particular slide here, and quickly, what does your brain tell you that word is? And I imagine that most of you are saying, oh, that word is poverty. Well, maybe not. Let's see the next slide. Again, this is just a kind of a clear example of how fast your brain is trying to tap into knowledge it already has, in this case, what that sequence of letters says. And then we come up with the term poverty as the answer to that question. If we were completely rational thinkers, we would be stumped by that first slide because we only see half of the letters, but that is not the way kind of our cognitive process works. Next. Particularly when we try to talk about human services and the public funding for them, and even the public programs that serve people, we are up against some really powerful cultural narratives about poverty, about poor people, about government as the nanny state, or as service providers as continuing to promote dependence on programs, etc. So this is a bumper sticker, painfully, that many of us have probably seen on cars around us. Next. So I want to, after giving you that kind of short introduction on kind of the kind of theories that underpin our work, talk a little bit about what we found in the research and about people's attitudes about government, because I think they're instructive to the human services field as well. Go ahead. I think we pretty much know what's out there in terms of dominant attitudes about government, particularly in this kind of hyper-partisan environment we find ourselves in these days, and a lot of dissatisfaction with how public programs are delivered. Next slide. As I mentioned before, there's particular negative attitudes about public programs that provide kind of social supports. You continue to have kind of an anti-welfare mentality among a lot of people and concerns about that. Go ahead. So what's behind all of that? When we try to talk to people about what government is and does, what are some of the things that are in the way? The first finding out of our research is a reminder that government for most people is kind of only dimly seen or dimly understood. Most people busy with their life, doing their job, getting their kids to school, etc., really don't think about government much at all. And I would argue that that's probably the same for a lot of the programs that you all run out there as well. You're so much closer to them, your clients and your staff and others, than your average neighbor, that we have to recognize that we're dealing with busy minds as much as anything. Next. A couple of key images really jump out for people when you're trying to talk to them about government from our perspective. The first is that it's just politics. And so this dominant image is one of bickering politicians in some sort of a fight, but that we are really spectators to that. And that whole idea kind of bleeds over into all the work of government and very difficult to penetrate. Next. The second kind of image that really emerged in our research that people carry around with them is that of a big and blurry and kind of undefined bureaucracy. And it's very hard for people when asked in some of the discourse sessions that we did and kind of questions on the street to even name a couple of key public programs that might be active in their community. So it's distant and again, kind of dimly understood. It is also mostly about politics, and if it's doing something, it's probably too big and too wasteful. Next slide. The third challenge that emerged in our work, and I think it has implications for the human services field as well, is that people have come to view their relationship to government as essentially one of a vending machine. I should decide if I'm going to put my dollar in and what service or benefit I want to get directly out. And if I'm not getting direct benefit myself from that, then I don't want to have to pay for it. And so you get crazy comments like, why should I pay for that increased school levy? My kids aren't in school anymore, et cetera. You can imagine examples of that. Next slide. So in addition to those kind of three challenging narratives that we laid out for you, there really are some alternative stories available to people. And I won't go into all the methodology we undertook, but we really spent almost a year digging into other kinds of conversations with people that triggered more productive attitudes and more productive dialogues and perspectives when we were trying to talk about public programs. And it really took first uncovering all of those hurdles and then trying to figure out how you reframe the conversation to be one that was more useful. So there are some new narratives, and we'll talk about those now. Next. The first kind of element of a new story about government really taps into some latent ideas that most people actually still carry around with them. When asked the question, why do we have government, even if they're frustrated with it, people will articulate notions of public purpose and the common good and community well-being and the unique roles the public sector is supposed to play as a foundation of a good society. They will think of things like clean water and safe food and regulations, kind of a role of protector, and recognize pretty quickly and even voice that there are things we can't do as individuals that we have to do together through the creation of these kinds of public systems. They really feel like there's a unique set of responsibilities for government to be thinking ahead as a manager and a planner, a steward of the kind of public infrastructure that we have and other services, and they want government to be the place where we just come together to figure out how to solve things. Next. One of the reasons why this particular focus on kind of mission and purpose of government, and I would argue in your field as well, is so important is that it attempts to tap into kind of deeply held values that people have and connect the dots between, in our case, particular activities of government and what people hold as a deep-seated value and things that they think are also important to how we run things. And this really derives from, again, a lot of important cognitive research that shows that we reason first from the values that we hold. Values help us answer quickly, why does this issue or this question or this program or this service matter to me? So it's very important to try and find ways to start a conversation with people through a values lens and not think that if we dig into the details of our policy or programs at the beginning that we have connected with people in any meaningful way. Next. Early work on this by Lakoff and Johnson in the 80s began to delineate what they called levels of thinking. So level one is that kind of values level, the big ideas, protection, justice, family, et cetera. Level two are the various issue arenas that we might be working in, and I imagine that people on this call are working in, and many of these are on here. And level three is the kind of policy detail. So the argument here from this part of the science is really to always be articulating that level one value as an entry point, as a way of setting up the conversation about an issue or a policy. Next. I'll give you an example of that. We did some work with folks working on public health, and they were trying to, in this one particular state that we were in, trying to extend access to clinics that provided immunizations. And this was a fairly standard quote out of their materials. So every child should have access to immunizations, that too many families are not bringing their kids into the clinics, and this is why we're proposing some new agency rules. Now, I think if you look at that, it's hard to find any kind of a value statement, an actual straight up discourse about why immunizing kids is important to the whole community, not just to those families. Without that orientation, if I don't have kids, I've probably already stopped reading the rest of your piece. I may also be bringing my own frames to this conversation, so it must be lazy families not bringing their kids in. Why should we be trying to make that easier for them? Next slide. Through an exercise we did with them, we really tried to dig out what is the core value behind childhood immunizations, and it is really one of protecting the health of the whole community and really needing to articulate that. Another step that was in there was to really make sure that people remember that there's a whole network of public health agencies and probably many nonprofits that are out there providing this important service, and that they needed to keep the clinic hours extended to keep up with growing demand. So as it turned out, it wasn't lazy parents. It was that many of the clinics actually stopped or closed at 5 or so, and many working families couldn't bring their kids in. So making this case, again, through this kind of level 1 value first, and then on the way down to the policy detail is a really important lesson in this work, I think. Next. On the public side, it's very hard to find examples of state agencies and advocates really trying to articulate the value behind key public programs. So particularly the TANF program that provides this kind of core cash assistance to very low-income families. This is one of the few examples I could find of people trying to talk about the values that this program supported and underpinned. So it's really, again, something for us to be creative about and think about how we elevate that conversation. Next. So one question I think I'd love to leave you with after this presentation is for you to go home and think a little bit about what is the public value or the shared value of the kind of services that you provide. And I really don't mean just the value to the individual clients and recipients of programs, but can you be thinking about the big level 1 kind of community-wide values that are improved or supported or created when the programs you provide are done well and provided to the community. Next. You may remember me talking about that second hurdle, that people see government as just a big bureaucracy. The antidote here and what we've really worked on is to really make sure that people are giving concrete and vivid images of the public systems that surround us and why they're important and how they work, and spend some more time on that fundamental piece of education. And I would argue that many of your programs are equally invisible, and you probably do some work on trying to get the profile of them raised out in the community. But don't assume that most of the people you're trying to talk to have much of a kind of system knowledge about the work that you're doing. And you may need to think about, are we doing enough to just create basic understanding of the network of human services that are out there that are important. Next. This is just a brief example of the kind of language that we try and get people to use and try and describe what government actually is and does. It uses what's called a simplifying model called public structures, and you can learn more about that on our website if you're curious. What you can see here is just an effort to kind of to deflate the kind of negative stereotypes when you just say the word government and try and first describe this set of systems and structures that we have built over decades. Maybe it's physical ones, maybe it's organizational ones, or social support systems. But all of this is trying to drive more system and structured thinking about this question as an alternative to the stereotypes and frames that we talked about. Next. The real challenge with the kind of consumer thinking model that we also talked about is how do we foster more civic and community-minded thinking? How do we reinforce notions of interdependence and working together and problem solving? There was remarkably, even in the kind of individualistic society that we live in that gets reinforced by a lot of our popular culture, there was a remarkable hunger in our discourse sessions and in the research we did among the people we talked to for more of a sense of community connection, that people really did care beyond just themselves and really did care about the quality of life in their neighborhoods and how folks around them were doing. They wanted to feel like they had a role to play. They're often frustrated that they don't know what things they could do to improve life in their neighborhood, or how they could engage, from our perspective, in the work of local governments in a better way and understand what's going on and not just be distant and frustrated. So I do think that there's a latent desire for more civic mindedness, and we have to think about ways to connect to that. I think collective language is also important, and so you can see there that we use the term our government, not the government in that one. So the new narratives that we really try and get people to think about and to reason about, and we work around the country training advocates and others on how to embed these ideas in their communications and advocacy, are to focus on the mission and purpose and what's uniquely public about something, to do a better job of evoking and articulating the systems and structures that surround us and why they're important, and again, this kind of civic thinking. We're trying to change the dominant narrative and the frame, if you will, from one of a big political fight or a bureaucracy or something that I only get a few things from, to a sense that government and the public sector is really our tool for figuring out how to solve things and to serve the common good. Next. I really think that I want to echo this one point as I was thinking about the parallels between our work and the work that you all do, particularly in human services programs. I think a standard practice, and it's one that makes a lot of sense, is to really highlight the individual benefit of the programs that we are providing, whether it's mental health services or housing or any other kind of social supports, that there's a real natural inclination to believe and that if we just put forward compelling profiles of the individuals who get services through what we do, that will drive understanding and support. And there's certainly some sense of that working. You get a charitable response that's useful. Some people have a lot of empathy for the clients of your programs. But one thing I think in our work around the field with nonprofits, and particularly people working on these social support services, we need to do a better job of helping people not judge that program by whether or not they get any direct benefit or whether or not they feel charitable towards the individuals who are getting it. But how does it really affect the quality of life in the community at large? What is the impact on all of us if we provide support for that program? So I think that's a really important thing for us to think about, doing a better job showing people that what we do is connected to a lot of what they care about in their community, and it's almost literally connected through a network of organizations, public and private, who are doing an enormous amount of work out there to make life better. So you might think about that as well. You can download actually on our website an exercise we use called the ripple effects exercise. And there's a way for you to think about, okay, here's a client in my program, but can I almost visually map all the other impacts of the service for that person on other sectors of the community, from the small business people locally, from the to the hospital, to the school nurse, you can imagine what all those things might be. When you create a map like that, you begin to create the elements of a different story, and one that is really a story of community impact and not just client benefit. Next. One subtle thing for you to pay attention to, I think, as well, and I know that this field pays a lot of attention to this challenge, and particularly the people who work on disabilities, is to be careful about labels that inadvertently come across as making it sound like the people receiving these benefits or availing themselves of our services are somehow different than me. And so anything that kind of puts the kind of conditions of people first, vulnerable children, struggling families, poor neighborhoods, disadvantaged populations, I would argue can have the effect of, again, distancing those people from the rest of the population who may not need those services. So it might just be like the disability community has taught us, people with disabilities versus disabled folks, et cetera. So one caution is to review the way we talk about clients and recipients and make sure that it is not inadvertently setting up kind of an us and them story, which works against, I would argue, the kind of community narrative that is also deeply powerful and that we need to evoke more often. Next. I really think, having done a fair amount of work in the nonprofit sector myself, and my wife is actually the president of the United Way here serving the Austin area, that nonprofits, and many of you who are in nonprofit human services providing organizations, are really at a unique place to change a lot of this conversation, both about your own services, but also about the larger network of social supports, public and nonprofit and private, that are out there. You all are at the intersection of community needs and solutions. You really are at the place that can transform this conversation from one that's just about charity to notions of community change, and I see a lot of good work in the field going on about that. Really fostering a sense of citizenship and civic thinking, and not just consumers or non-consumers of services. And not just a story of how we respond to crisis, but that we're there all the time creating systems that help our society function. And again, I just encourage you to really take advantage of the posture you find yourself in to change this story. Next slide. I ran across a report also that kind of talks about this intersection between nonprofits and government, and I'd recommend it to you. The title is on the slide. It really talks about just how interconnected these sectors are. And so while my day job is to try and rebuild support for the public sector, a lot of the work I do in the field is actually with nonprofit organizations who are receiving funding from or trying to support the kind of intersection they have with public programs. I'll just let you take a minute and read this. I do think that this is another disconnect that's out there in the public. There is a sense that the nonprofit sector can somehow do better what government shouldn't be doing, or that they are completely separate and they have completely separate kinds of priorities and approaches. And one of the things that certainly I think would help us all if people really understood just how interwoven the public things we do and what tax dollars support are with the nonprofit that they may see in their community doing good work and may even be supporting, but not seeing the ways in which it's directly connected to the adequacy of public funding, whether that's direct or indirect, and that those systems have to work well together. So again, I would encourage you to find ways to drive that connection a little bit more closely and not disconnect it. Next slide. So when you can, even when you're frustrated, I think there's ways that the nonprofit sector and human service providers can really defend the public sector and adequate public funding, and many of you may do that. One thing I wanted to just address briefly here, many of you may also have critiques of when your public sector partners are not doing a good job, or when a particular state agency is not living up to the goals that it has. And there are ways, I'm not telling you to avoid critiquing government, and we have an entire module on how to critique government without undermining it. But I think there are ways to do that that tap into some of the three principles I talked about before. So I'll give you one short anecdote. And that is that we worked with a group of child welfare advocates and service providers in Washington State, and they really asked us after some brief presentations, what do we do if we think that the public welfare agency, the child welfare agency, should be blown up, that it's completely dysfunctional? And so you have one option there. You can just kind of pile on and just suggest that this is another bureaucracy that can't do its work and fuel the kind of dominant negative government attitudes. Or to change the conversation, can you really talk about the fundamental mission that's at stake here and why it's so critical that they get it right? And so instead of leading with maybe we should blow up this agency, which we certainly encourage them not to do, they developed a set of talking points that basically said, we believe that protecting the most vulnerable children in our state is an essential public priority. This agency is not living up to that goal. How do we together, the public, agencies, and government, fix that agency so that it's doing its job? And so in that case, you're really tapping into the unique mission and purpose of that public sector agency, not shying away from critiquing it for not living up to it, but also owning the problem as citizens together rather than just being a distant bureaucracy that can't work. Next. Next slide, I think. We got it there. So you'll have these slides later, but a couple of examples of ways that we talk about public systems and services, a similar parallel to how human services are part of how we contribute to the health and well-being of our community. These are attempts to kind of assert this role of these two systems together and how they serve all of us, not just individual clients. Next slide. The more and more that I do this work around the country, the more I like this quote by Robert Putnam, in that he, in a growing and rapidly diversifying society that we live in, one of our key challenges is to broaden the sense of who we is. And I know that many of you probably really struggle with the way people isolate or the stereotypes they have about the clients of many of your programs. And I think this is one of the core challenges. How do we constantly reinforce notions of interdependence, of shared fate, and of what we means? And so I'll leave you with that quote, and we'll have a chance for a set of questions. I think that to remind you, and maybe my fellow organizers can remind you that there are some ways for you to type in questions to send them to us. I'm happy to answer questions about the specific research we've done, the ways in which I think what we've learned might map onto the human services field, or anything else that might be on your minds. to my fellow panelists, I'm not sure I can see the questions, given my kind of locked up panel here. So if you see some coming in and just want to say them out loud on the phone, I'm happy to kind of weigh in.
Sure. While we're looking at the questions, one that comes to mind is whether there is a macro strategy to change the framing of government. You're giving advice to a lot of us individually and to different agencies and so forth. Is there a movement, or can there be?
There is, and we certainly believe that there can be. So Public Works is dedicated to this small task, and so we travel around the country trying to help people be better advocates for the public sector, even while they're doing their particular detailed policy work or managing a public agency, et cetera. We are about to launch a major new consortium that is trying to partner with the handful of like-minded organizations around the country, particularly nationally, who share our goal of trying to change the American conversation about government and its society. We're calling it We the People, and you can actually learn more about that too from us. We are first beginning to join with the Roosevelt Institute, in particular their campus network of millennials that are doing really interesting work on policy, and the Center for Effective Government. Again, both of those are nationally focused organizations. The steps we're beginning to take on that, Irv, are first, a major refresh of the research that we did about a decade ago and then off and on over the years that would really look into where are we in our culture now about discourse about government, what's different, how do we get past the kind of hyper-politics that we face and partisanship we face. We'll also look more specifically into how we reclaim the kind of governance systems and so that they work for people and aren't so deeply frustrating. And then some pretty particular look at how millennials and communities of color currently view government and what it would take to engage them in kind of a reclamation of the public sector. We're likely to have in the coming years a large leadership institute for people who want to be part of a larger movement to kind of change the dialogue about government. Would have some opportunities to learn from some of the best minds trying to figure this out, and we'll be sponsoring more research. So thank you for asking that question, because I think we really feel like this is the time to take this. You know, we've been working in the vineyard out there in the States for a number of years, but to ratchet this conversation up to a national dialogue is really our goal in the next couple of years.
Sure. Marlo Nash has pointed out that there's an effort in New Jersey, a local coalition of community benefit organizations versus referring to themselves as nonprofit organizations. They've been successful in garnering some public funds in this manner. Do you think this term of community benefit organization has broad application?
I think that's really interesting. I know Marlo, and I would love to talk to her more about that, because I think they are, you know, it sounds to me like they're really trying to tell this community impact story versus just we deliver services to X and Y client. You know, certainly part of a larger effort, a larger public education campaign, and a kind of a rebranding of how we see human services, or as a friend of mine said, how do you focus more on the human part of that question? I think all of that makes sense. I would love to learn more, so it sounds like a good idea.
Great. And Abby Evans has asked if you could talk more about critiquing government without undermining it.
Sure. Again, we work a lot with organizations who are frustrated with a particular state agency or with advocates and others whose primary job is to be kind of watchdogs for whether or not the public systems are working. And so that's a valuable and important role in democracy. And if you look at our materials, we explicitly say we're not trying to make excuses for government when it doesn't work. I think the key challenge, if you're in that position, is to not feed the anti-government fire, if you will. And so if you just write it off as just another political fight, or that's just politicians being politicians, or this is just another bumbling bureaucracy, those stories are so dominant in the culture that our perspective is they do not engage people to want to change the problem. They just increase cynicism and want people to essentially dismiss it and walk away from it. We all know that we have to have a functioning and well-supported public sector. So even when we need to critique it, the core points for us are to first highlight what is the unique public mission of this agency, of this public process, of this public service. And if it's not working, we can talk about that, but to own the problem ourselves as citizens. And so, again, if you want to download this short little exercise paper on our website, it kind of walks you through a little formula that as a way of thinking about, okay, I've got this critique, how could I make it constructively in a way that doesn't trigger the negative frames? And so I would just refer her to that material.
Great. We have, this question actually comes from the National Assembly itself. We're organized in agencies. How do we change the frame of a sector or a system? And just parenthetically, we think about this at the Assembly about thinking beyond the brand.
Right. Yeah, and I would love to hear, I know you've been thinking about this quite a bit, so certainly weigh in with some of what your perspective on this is. I think it's somewhat inevitable that we operate in individual sectors and that we have particular kind of service categories. I mean, funding drives that, programs drive that. I mean, there's lots of natural reasons why our conversation about what we do tends to break out into kind of these different kind of parallel categories. I do think we can do a lot better job, though, of showing how each one is connected to the other and the impacts of the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of one set of work, the lack of support here affecting some critical program there, to really almost paint a better and quickly visual for people of this network of services that all share some common themes and goals, and maybe more attention to that common story is useful. But to paint that picture for people in a way so they don't say, oh, all I really care about is mental health, and I don't really care what's happening to funding in public education or in homelessness issues or something like that. The more we can tell the kind of interlocked story of both when we succeed, the ways that works, and the kind of challenges we face, I think that's a good direction to go in. What do you think, Irv? Yeah, you've written about this, I know. So.
Yeah, you articulated very well. We really feel very strongly about it. You can have a great brand, and you should be gung-ho your brand and the great and unique contributions of your organization, but we won't really thrive as a society if we only promote our individual brands. And there really is the interdependence of human life, and there's the interdependence of human-serving organizations. So it's very short-sighted to only think about your brand. It's very important to do so, but if we want to turn the tide in terms of public will, which is what, Patrick, your work is all about, we have to be speaking about the greater good that we all serve, the values that we all connect with. We have a good question, another good question. They are all good questions, and please send in more. This one from Allison Sesso. Have you done any thinking about the term nonprofit, similar to the comment about community benefit organizations that Marla asked earlier? It seems weak and problematic. Many have said, this is my parenthetical, that it's defining us by what we are not. We've heard the term independent sector, third sector. These aren't very exciting either.
Yeah.
But what about for purpose or something like that? Have you and your organization given any thought to the labeling of nonprofits?
I've kind of given the same kind of cursory review of it that you just articulated. You know, like it doesn't sound great. It defines us by what we're not, by a tax status, all those things. I can't say that I have certainly not come up with the perfect replacement, but I do think it's a good question to ask, and so it might be interesting to kind of find out more about the New Jersey effort and just see kind of what process they went through to come to that conclusion, and maybe there are lessons for us to think about how we talk about this sector slightly differently, and even some new terminology. Most importantly, whatever term we land on is to make sure that the understanding we leave people with, again, is much more of this broader community well-being impact. And so maybe that's the tagline that follows. Whatever we get stuck with is the simple label. But it seems like we should put some good cognitive thinkers and rebranders on that question.
Mm-hmm. And really in that vein, Jenna Cooper is asking about how we help aspiring human service professionals, nonprofit professionals, to think more broadly than their own entrepreneurial interests. many of whom, many of these aspiring professionals have ambitions to start their own nonprofits. How do we get them to think about the broader picture too? Give them advice, pro and con, and so forth. What kind of advice can we give them?
I mean, my sense is, and sometimes I do this exercise in rooms of people who work in the social services and human serving field, is to first get people to reflect on what they're trying to achieve. I mean, these sound like simple questions, but what improvement in the community are they really looking to make happen, and why, and what drives them? One of the ways to get at the kind of level 1 values behind your work is even just to ask yourself, why do I get up every day and do this? What is the big idea behind it? So I think at one level, some disciplined examination of that is useful. And then maybe, again, this ripple effects exercise we talked about, I think almost a visual map of so where would I plug in? If that's my goal, who else is doing what in my community? And how am I a value added to this network that already exists and not just, something else added on? And if we can be honest about answering those questions, then I think you find the niche that kind of adds to the whole and doesn't have a whole set of new competing organizations. That's not easy to do. People are motivated to find a niche and go for it, or have a good idea and build it. But I do see in more and more places, coalitions and others trying to ask hard and clarifying questions about how does our entire network together meet various needs. Are there gaps? Are there overlaps? And then be honest about the role that we can and should play.
Great. This one's from Michael McGrath, who observes that people don't think of government or human services as pursuing innovation, yet innovation is what runs the private sector. And I think if folks saw the public sector as curious for innovation, things would be better. What about the association, lack of association between public sector, human services, and innovation?
That's a great question. And I think that what's always surprising to me is how much innovation is actually going on, and yet how invisible it is. So certainly in our work in the public sector, we have a monthly newsletter we put out, and we are often highlighting a really interesting practice that's out there in the field, public agencies that are innovating and a lot of the good work that's going on. So certainly I think there's two things on that. One, we should as sectors, the public sector itself and human services sector should be consciously trying to drive an innovation agenda and really looking for that and really spending energy on it. But I also think we rarely tell that story. And so a lot of our story is just kind of on delivery and not the kind of creative thinking that might be really going on in aspects of our sector. So that's part of it. I think finding those kind of pieces of good work that are going on, or things that I think would surprise most people in terms of innovation, and make sure that we are both learning from them as a system, but also doing a better job of showing the public that there's actually a tremendous amount of innovation happening all around them every day in these sectors that may to them appear monolithic and static. And I think that those of us who work in the field know that may be true to some extent in some places, but there's an awful lot of change happening too.
Really, I'm in that. I think we don't talk enough about innovation within government and within foundations, services, and so forth. So we can help nonprofit and governmental workers to understand that you can be within an organization. You can innovate systems and all of that. Another question, when defining values, how important is focus groups and polling? This is a question.
How important are focus groups and polling to finding out these issues, these kind of questions? I'm sorry, I missed part of that.
Yes, when defining the common values, how important is message research, focus groups, and polling?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly has been fundamental to our work. The only caution I would suggest is that a lot of standard kind of polling has a particular purpose. It's really trying to read where people are right now, like take a temperature, if you will, of where opinion is. And there are a lot of reasons to need that. particularly in campaign cycles or particular policy fights, that's important. The work that we're doing, and then I would argue that a sector as important and as broad as the human services sector, is trying to think about, is really trying to understand at a deeper level what's going on in the culture. For me, if I'm trying to change American attitudes about government, that's culture change. And so that just means that the kinds of focus groups that you do, the kinds of polling, really need to be informed by the kind of science that understands linguistics and cognitive work, and again, psychology and anthropology. And so I don't think we dip into some of those broader social science fields enough to give us real insights into what's behind the numbers of the polling. So, and sometimes I think we can do things informally different than we often do. I give one anecdote to that is that, there were some advocates we were working for, and they were typically used to providing presentations in local communities about what was going on at the state capitol, particularly in funding for a set of human services programs. And so they were used to providing a presentation where they show up in the room and they begin leaping right into the details of this or that budget item, this or that kind of policy. And we really worked with them to think about whether or not they were having any conversation at all about the larger public values of these things to really motivate people to act. And so they began to change the conversation in the church basements and the meeting rooms that they were in to first ask the people in the room, often who were just community members coming because they expressed some interest. For example, they were in Eau Claire. So what do you love about living in Eau Claire? What makes this a good community? What are some of the things that would really improve it? And to really begin by drawing out of the room the kind of underlying community values that people had. And then they could connect the dots between the individual kinds of issue and policy and funding news that they had to that broader set of kind of shared public values that were alive in the community. And even that experience for them was kind of an informal focus group, because what emerged was definitely a values conversation, or where were the places that people cared a lot about something that was working or not working. So I would even encourage people to find ways to have that kind of a values-based interaction with the people that they're trying to talk to.
Last question. How do you balance this rational, values-based approach with the irrational polarization of the political debate?
Well, certainly from our perspective, working on the public sector question, we really try and articulate how, we have to fix, we don't spend a lot of energy on the polarized part of it. What we have found in our work is that most people are very hungry for a different conversation, something that is not inherently political and partisan. And when you can tap into that, they're actually very interested in trying to make the public systems work. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is just recognize that that same kind of frustration is out there, and how do we move people to a different place? We're hoping in this next round of research to understand a little bit more about how we reclaim the political process to not just be about a fight, but to be about the place where we do come to consensus and solve some problems practically. So we're hoping for more research on that intersection in the next year.
Great. Well, everyone, thank you very much for your time and your interest and your questions. And Patrick, thank you for, once again, a really great presentation. We will be making the presentation available. And if you are inclined to be involved in the cadre of citizens that we're trying to mobilize to change the frame for human services, just send one of us at the National Assembly an email. My email is irv@nassembly.org. And Patrick, you can't see it, but we're now all giving you a standing ovation. So thank you very much. Take care all.
Thank you. Glad to be with you today.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.